AITA for not hosting Christmas because my family treats me like a maid. They are turning my house into a hotel. For the past 6 years, I have hosted Christmas at my house. And when I say hosted, I mean I have basically run an unpaid holiday resort where my family arrives expecting a 5-star experience while I single-handedly cook, clean, and cater to their every whim. What started as an attempt to create warm holiday memories has turned into an exhausting, thankless tradition that leaves me drained, frustrated, and, if I'm being completely honest, resentful. It always begins the same way. My parents and my sister's family arrive in waves, dropping off their coats, bags, and general chaos like my home is some kind of lobby where bellhops are supposed to handle everything. My dad makes a beeline for the living room, plops down in front of the TV, and does not move unless it's to shuffle to the kitchen and grab himself a drink. My mom, ever the perfectionist, immediately starts inspecting my house as if she's conducting a white glove test in a 5-star hotel. She never fails to find something that isn't quite right, a smudge on the counter, a candle that has burned unevenly, a meal that isn't cooked exactly the way she would have done it. My sister, who insists she is so grateful that I take on the burden of hosting, treats my home like an all-inclusive resort. She barely lifts a finger and lets her children run absolutely wild. They jump on my furniture, scatter toys in every room, and seem to believe my home is a lawless wasteland where shoes do not belong on feet, snacks can be grabbed with sticky hands, and personal belongings, mine, of course, are fair game to be played with, hidden, or broken. The worst part is that despite all this, I am expected to keep the Christmas magic alive. I am the one sweating in the kitchen, preparing a feast that will be devoured in minutes with little more than a passing, "This is good," before everyone moves on. I am the one making sure there are clean towels for showers, that the guest beds are made, that there is coffee in the morning and wine in the evening. I am the one cleaning up the disaster zone that appears out of nowhere, wrapping paper strewn across the floor, dishes piled high in the sink, my once organized fridge raided by people who apparently believe my leftovers exist for their taking. Last year was my breaking point. My sister, in her usual entitled fashion, decided that sharing is caring applied to food that wasn't hers. Without asking, she packed up a massive portion of leftovers, including the cheesecake I had specifically made for my husband's birthday the next day. When I finally saw what she had done, I snapped. I wasn't even subtle about it. I asked, no, demanded, help with cleaning up the mess they had all left behind, because I was sick and tired of being treated like a maid. My mother sighed in that dramatic, woe-is-me way she does and said, well, that's what happens when you choose to be the host. That sentence echoed in my head for months. When you choose to be the host. As if this was some grand privilege that I had bestowed upon myself. As if I had not, year after year, bent over backward to make Christmas special for them while they contributed nothing but stress and destruction. It was in that moment that I decided, would not be hosting again. I was done. This year, when the topic of Christmas came up, I told them plainly, I'm not hosting this year. I wasn't rude about it. I even offered solutions. I suggested we rotate hosting duties so that someone else could take on the responsibility. If that wasn't an option, we could all pitch in and book a nice dinner somewhere, enjoy a meal together without the stress of one person carrying the entire weight of the holiday. You would have thought I had just declared Christmas itself was cancelled. My mother immediately called me selfish, saying I was ruining the holiday tradition. My sister, ever the martyr, dramatically lamented that she can't possibly host because her apartment is too small. I pointed out that I had never once heard her offer to help when I was hosting, so surely she could at least try. She refused. My father, in his usual passive way, muttered something about how Christmas won't be the same if we didn't all gather at my house like we always did. And now, apparently, I am the villain of the family. The group chat has become a passive-aggressive war zone, with my mother sending guilt-tripping messages about how she just doesn't understand what has changed. My sister sent a pointed text about how some people don't value family enough to make sacrifices, conveniently ignoring the fact that I have been the one making all the sacrifices for 6 years. Even my dad, who usually doesn't engage, chimed in about how it's just easier at my house. Yes, of course it's easier. For them. But for me? It has been years of exhaustion, of biting my tongue, of doing all the work with none of the appreciation. I refuse to be guilt-tripped into spending another holiday miserable while they treat my home like a free hotel. If they want to celebrate together, they can figure it out. I am done. So, tell me, am I the asshole for finally putting my foot down? Update 1. After all the bullying in the group chat, I decided to stand my ground. No more hosting. No more unpaid labor disguised as family tradition. No more running around like a stressed-out holiday concierge while everyone else sat back, stuffing their faces and contributing nothing but noise and mess. I was done, period. For years, I had taken on the burden without question, assuming that this was just how things were supposed to be. I had told myself that it was worth it, that creating a warm, welcoming holiday for my family was a noble, selfless thing to do. But the truth was, it wasn't selflessness, it was servitude. I had been running myself ragged to make sure everyone else had the perfect Christmas, and in return, I got exhaustion, stress, and a trashed house. I had spent 6 years bending over backward to accommodate them, putting aside my own comfort, my own peace, my own ability to enjoy the holiday. And for what? A pat on the back. A half-hearted thanks as they walked out the door with my leftovers in their hands. A sigh from my mother when I dared to ask for help cleaning up. No. Not this year. Not ever again. But despite my newfound resolve, I was still curious. What would they do now that their personal holiday maid had quit? Christmas wasn't my responsibility alone, though they had certainly acted like it was. They wanted Christmas, didn't they? They wanted the cozy gathering, the homemade feast, the picture-perfect celebration. Well, now they would have to figure it out on their own. For weeks, the group chat became a passive-aggressive war zone. My mother, unsurprisingly, took on the role of the wounded matriarch, sending long, meandering texts about how she just didn't understand why everything had to change. She lamented the loss of our tradition, as if the tradition had ever been anything more than me playing hostess while everyone else enjoyed themselves. My sister was less poetic in her approach, opting instead for barely concealed jabs. Some people just don't care about family enough to make sacrifices. Oh, the irony. The same sister who never lifted a finger to help me suddenly considered me the selfish one. My father, predictably, stayed mostly silent. His contributions were limited to vague statements like, "It's always been this way," and "Christmas should be about family." As if those statements meant anything. As if they weren't just empty words thrown into the void to make him feel like he had participated in the conversation without actually taking a stance. I didn't engage. I let them vent their frustrations into the void while I enjoyed something I hadn't experienced in years, the simple pleasure of knowing that for once, I wouldn't be the one breaking my back to make Christmas happen. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel regretful. I felt free. Then, just a few weeks before Christmas, my sister made her grand announcement in the group chat. She declared, with a kind of smug self-righteousness, that Christmas would be hosted at her apartment this year. "If you don't want to be with us, we'll manage on our own," she wrote, as if she were bravely saving Christmas from the grasp of my selfishness. As if she had swooped in like some holiday savior, gallantly taking on the task I had so cruelly abandoned. I just replied, "Great. I hope you all succeed." But I knew. I knew how this was going to go. Christmas morning, my phone buzzed with the first sign of trouble. It was my mother. She didn't even bother with pleasantries. "This is terrible. She doesn't even have enough chairs," she whispered, as if she were delivering classified military intelligence. I almost laughed. Not enough chairs. That was just the beginning. A short while later, my sister sent a message in the group chat. "And what did you do when the turkey didn't fit in the oven?" I stared at my phone for a long moment, considering my options. I could help. I could tell her how to cut it down, how to adjust the racks, how to make it work. I could swoop in, save the day, be the responsible one yet again. But I didn't. I set my phone down and went back to enjoying my peaceful, stress-free Christmas. By the evening, the real meltdown had begun. The next day, my sister called me, and I could hear the exhaustion in her voice before she even spoke. The kids had destroyed her apartment. Food had been overcooked to the point of being inedible. My mother had left early, saying she didn't like the atmosphere. My dad had fallen asleep on her couch, completely oblivious to the disaster unfolding around him. It had been, according to her, the worst Christmas of her life. I listened. I sympathized. I let her vent. And I enjoyed every second of it. I had spent years running myself ragged so that they could have a perfect Christmas. And yet, the second they had to put in the effort, it all fell apart. That was the difference. That was the truth they had refused to acknowledge for years. Christmas wasn't magical because it was some innate, effortless tradition. Christmas had only ever worked because I had killed myself making it work. Without me, it was just chaos. I didn't say that, of course. I just let her talk. Let her complain. Let her process her own failure. And then, the final twist, the cherry on top of this gloriously messy disaster. At some point between storming out of my sister's apartment in disgust and calling me to whisper her complaints, my mother had come to a shocking revelation. Hosting Christmas was hard. Hosting Christmas was stressful. Hosting Christmas, it turned out, was actually a lot of work. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't worth the effort. So now, suddenly, she had a new idea. Maybe it was too much to celebrate at home. Maybe a restaurant would be better next year. I just smiled and wished them luck. Update 2. The following year, it seemed obvious that a restaurant would be the best solution. After the catastrophe that unfolded at my sister's apartment the previous Christmas, it was clear that no one in my family had the energy, patience, or skill to host a holiday celebration without turning it into a complete disaster. I had assumed, naively, perhaps, that they had learned their lesson. That they had finally understood what I had been trying to say for years. That hosting was exhausting, that it required an incredible amount of preparation, and that it was not some magical event that simply happened without effort. But as Christmas approached, the group chat had been suspiciously quiet. No discussions of reservations. No confirmations about where we'd be going. And then, a few weeks before the holiday, my mother suddenly declared that celebrating at home was still warmer, and that it only made sense to bring the tradition back to where it had always belonged, my house. It was not framed as a suggestion, nor a request. It was stated as a simple fact, as though last year's fiasco had never happened, as though the meltdown at my sister's apartment had simply been an unfortunate, isolated incident and not a direct result of their own inability to function without someone else doing all the work. My sister immediately supported the idea, saying that my house was more comfortable, that there was more space, that it just made sense. The group chat soon became a chorus of predictable arguments, how family traditions should be honored, how Christmas had always been special at my place, how everything used to be so wonderful before I had decided to change things. Not a word about how exhausting it had been for me. Not a single mention of the years I had spent cleaning, cooking, planning, and hosting. No acknowledgement of the stress, the frustration, the sheer amount of effort it had taken to create the illusion of a perfect, effortless holiday. As if I had never struggled. As if I had never once said how much it drained me. As if it had been easy all along. I realized then that they had never truly understood. That they had not, in fact, learned any lesson at all. The only thing they had learned from last year was that they didn't like being responsible for Christmas. And now, rather than finding a solution that worked for everyone, they were simply trying to shift the burden back onto me. But this time, I had no intention of bending. Fine. They wanted to have Christmas at my house. Then we would do things differently. This time, there would be no decorations, no perfectly arranged festive table, no carefully planned menu. There would be no warm glow of candlelight, no scent of mulled wine filling the air, no neatly wrapped gifts waiting under a tree. The house would remain exactly as it was on any other day. No effort. No preparation. No pretense. If they wanted Christmas at my house so badly, then they could see exactly what it meant to host a holiday without the silent, invisible work of the person who had always made it happen. On Christmas Day, the first wave of guests arrived, expecting the usual warmth, the familiar holiday charm. Instead, they walked into a house that looked no different than it had on any other day of the year. The absence of decorations was the first thing they noticed. No garlands, no festive centerpieces, no twinkling lights. Just my living room, my kitchen, my dining table, bare and unremarkable. At first, they tried to act like nothing was wrong, as if it wasn't strange that the house wasn't dressed in its usual holiday attire. But then, the real horror began to dawn on them. There was no smell of cooking in the air. No bubbling pots on the stove. No trays of appetizers waiting to be served. The kitchen was silent. The oven was cold. There was no food on the table. Panic began to set in almost immediately. They had expected to walk into the comforting embrace of a home that had already been transformed for them. They had expected the table to be set, the wine to be poured, the food to be ready. They had expected the same effortless magic that they had always enjoyed. And now, standing there in my undecorated house, faced with an empty kitchen and a bare table, they realized for the first time that none of it had ever been effortless at all. At first, they tried to hide their disappointment. There was a brief, awkward attempt at pretending everything was fine. But gradually, as the minutes stretched on and it became increasingly clear that nothing had been prepared, the mood began to shift. Someone, probably my mother, made a passive-aggressive remark about how different everything felt this year. My sister, still clinging to the hope that things would somehow fix themselves, suggested that we just get started, as if the food would magically appear if they simply sat down. And then came the realization that nothing had been planned. There was no menu. No meal. No carefully organized schedule. The traditional Christmas dinner, the one they had always taken for granted, had never existed on its own. I had made it happen. And this time, I had chosen not to. What followed was nothing short of chaotic. There was a frantic scramble to come up with a solution. At first, there was talk of cooking something simple, but of course, no one had thought to bring ingredients. Then, in a desperate bid to salvage the evening, someone suggested ordering delivery. But, as they quickly discovered, Christmas Day was not exactly the best time to rely on last-minute takeout. Most places were closed or had long wait times. And so, for the first time in years, they were forced to do what they had never done before: they had to figure it out themselves. Plates were pulled from cupboards. Responsibilities were divided. Someone tried to put together a makeshift meal from whatever could be scrounged up. There was no coordination, no plan, just a haphazard attempt to salvage what had already been lost. The result was a dinner that was nothing like the lavish, carefully prepared feasts they had grown accustomed to. Instead of a beautifully roasted turkey, they had whatever they could throw together at the last minute. Instead of a festive, decorated table, they had clutter and mismatched plates. Instead of a smoothly flowing evening, they had stress, frustration, and the dawning realization that hosting was work. The atmosphere was nothing like it had been in previous years. The illusion of effortless holiday magic had been shattered. The warm, welcoming Christmas they had always taken for granted had never existed on its own. I had been the one who created it, and without my silent labor, without my time and effort, without the planning and execution that I had poured into every previous year, the holiday was nothing more than a group of people sitting in a house, trying and failing to recreate what they had never appreciated in the first place. When everyone finally left, they didn't just leave behind scattered dishes and an untidy house. They left behind something else, something far heavier. The silence that followed their departure was not just the absence of voices or movement. It was the silence of realization. The silence of understanding. The silence of an unspoken admission of defeat. And in that silence, one thing became clear: next year, no one would dare to repeat this adventure again. Update 3. After all the past trials, it became clear that my family simply could not organize Christmas the way they had grown used to. They were perfectly capable of throwing together a last-minute, chaotic mess of a gathering, but when it came to recreating the holiday experience they had always taken for granted, the warm, beautifully decorated home, the meticulously planned meals, the effortless flow of the evening, they simply didn't have it in them. Last year had proven that beyond a doubt. The disaster that unfolded in my undecorated, unprepared home had shattered whatever delusions they still clung to. So this time, there were no arguments, no expectations, no hopeful suggestions that I might reconsider. There was no polite coercion, no group chat discussions about what we were going to do, no attempts to pressure me back into the role of host. A full month before Christmas, it was announced, we would not be celebrating together. A trip had already been planned, accommodations booked, tickets purchased. There would be no alternatives, no last-minute changes, no room for negotiation. The reaction was predictable. The group chat, which had been strangely quiet in the weeks leading up to this announcement, exploded with outrage. My mother, never one to accept change gracefully, was the first to react. She filled the chat with long, emotional messages about how Christmas was meant to be a family holiday, how it was a time to be together, how it was selfish to run off and leave everyone else to fend for themselves. My sister, still bitter from her own failed attempt at hosting, expressed her frustration in a much more blunt manner, complaining that she was once again being left alone to handle the logistics of the holiday. My father, true to form, simply agreed with whoever had spoken last, contributing little beyond vague affirmations that yes, this was all very unfortunate. The passive aggression was relentless. There were pointed comments about how some people only cared about themselves, subtle jabs about how things used to be different, how family was supposed to be a priority. It was exhausting, but it was also completely ineffective. Because this time, it didn't work. Every manipulative tactic they had used in the past, every guilt trip, every emotional plea, it all fell flat. I wasn't bending. I wasn't wavering. I was going on this trip, and they would have to figure out Christmas without me. And for the first time in years, Christmas was exactly what it should have been, relaxing. The time that had once been spent cooking, cleaning, and catering to others was now filled with actual enjoyment. Mornings were spent waking up to the sound of waves instead of clattering dishes. Afternoons were filled with long, unhurried walks instead of frantic preparations. Evenings were spent enjoying quiet dinners, drinks by the water, peaceful moments free from stress and obligation. There were no dishes to wash, no last-minute grocery store runs, no mental exhaustion from trying to ensure everyone else was having a perfect time while I struggled to stay afloat. For the first time in so many years, Christmas felt like a holiday. It was a revelation. A weight I hadn't even fully acknowledged was lifted, and in its place was something I had forgotten existed during the holidays, peace. There was no tension. No endless cycle of giving and receiving nothing in return. No exhaustion. Just genuine, uninterrupted relaxation. And then, when the trip was over, I returned home expecting to find my family still bitter, still resentful, still convinced that I had abandoned them to a miserable, joyless holiday. But what I found instead was something entirely unexpected. They had gathered for Christmas. Without me. And not just that, they had done something they had once sworn was completely out of the question. They had gone to a restaurant. The same family that had spent years insisting that Christmas had to be held at home, that tradition was sacred, that celebrating anywhere else was unthinkable, had somehow, without me there to carry the burden, made the radical decision to simply go out to eat. No one had cooked. No one had cleaned. No one had spent the evening exhausted and overwhelmed. And, most surprisingly of all, no one had complained that it wasn't the same. What had once seemed unimaginable had suddenly become the obvious solution. There were no emotional recaps in the group chat this time. No dramatic retellings of how difficult it had been, no claims that it just wasn't the same without me. Just silence. A kind of quiet acknowledgement that, despite all their previous resistance, they had managed. That their stubbornness had never been about tradition, or family, or sentiment, it had been about convenience. It had been about keeping the status quo that benefited them, about avoiding change because change would have meant acknowledging just how much work I had been doing all those years. And then, a few days later, something even more unexpected happened. A message from my mother. Short. Simple. Without manipulation or condescension or a single trace of guilt-tripping. We understand. I'm sorry. That was it. No long-winded justifications, no passive-aggressive remarks about how I had overreacted, no attempts to downplay their behavior. Just an acknowledgement. A long-overdue admission that they had finally seen what I had been trying to show them for years. For the first time in a long time, something had changed. And that was the greatest Christmas miracle.